Hey guys, welcome back. So now, I just finished Jupiter's Legacy, Season 1, like all of it. And after that, I went back and read Jupiter's Legacy and Jupiter's Circle, both volumes 1 and 2 of each. And I just figured like, hey, let me do a video and see what you guys are thinking. Because this story going throughout all the volumes, like it is nuts. So I just figured I'd do a video starting with Jupiter's Circle, Volume 1, and just see what you guys think. And if you guys want, we'll continue, and if not, we'll just keep it moving. But even with starting with Jupiter's Circle, first I'll get into a bit of the origin, which is in Jupiter's Legacy, but from there we'll jump right back into Jupiter's Circle because the introduction in Legacy leads right into Jupiter's Circle. And I figured we'd do it that way because if you guys want to continue, it would just make more sense to take a lot of these long flashbacks and put them in order, or at least talk about them in an order that's more linear and feels more consecutive. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so all of this starts off with Sheldon Sampson, who had lost everything in the Great Depression back in 1929. And for Sheldon, through all of his years of school, and even later to college, and from there going to the board of his father's company, he describes his life and his experiences as privileged to where nothing went wrong. So for him, having everything blown away in one single day, he expresses that that was his introduction or his first taste of failure. But then right after this, keeping him up at night, but then also later in his dreams, he would often see this island calling out to him, promising salvation for a country and a constitution that meant more than life itself. And with the island assuring him that his finest hour was yet to come, it then told him that great gifts lay beneath its shores, and his task was to bring them a nation needing heroes. And this is what led Sheldon to grab his brother Walter and a few college buddies by the name of Fitz, Grace, Richard, and George, and bring them on a journey from America to this island through England and Europe and eventually North Africa. And like with them finding a captain in a ship, like this part just worked out. Because Sheldon approaches Captain Borges and he just tells him the truth while pointing to a blank spot on the map, and Captain Borges agrees when the other 5 vouch for Sheldon. But then also with them arriving and actually seeing this island with their own eyes, Captain Borges gets a little nervous. But it's also around this time where Sheldon assures him that the island doesn't make mistakes, that it wants him here because perhaps the island sees something in Captain Borges that he doesn't see in himself. But with arriving on this island is when they got up close to it, they then noticed that what had looked like rock from afar was actually alien hardware. And the jungle covering a majority of the island, it had been centuries of vegetation that had grown here over the years, with it waiting for the perfect candidates. And with Sheldon and the others making their way through the island's terrain to its peak like Sheldon had seen in his dreams, it's here where they noticed that the island was a machine that was crisscrossed with metals that none of them had seen before. And from the time that it was placed here, it had been kept hidden with a cloaking device, allowing it to either disappear or reappear. But with making their way to the top, a door just opens from the wall to where they enter this room that has a sky in it, and Walter's just like, how this room got a sky? And Sheldon didn't know the answer. He just like, man, all's gonna be explained. Like he didn't know all the details. But with arriving here, this is where they met the alien creatures who had called them there to give them powers to save their dying country, which from there is how they all got their gifts. But I also want to say, like, when I went through this, one of the things that stood out to me was like much of the translation had went through Sheldon as far as the message from this island and what the gifts were meant to be used for. And with much of it being left to mystery as far as this alien race and how they gave them these powers and the true details of why they gave them these powers, and it really just seems like it may have been lost in communication to Sheldon, with him getting the directions clear, but the intention catered to what he needed or what he wanted. And I could be left field with that. Who knows? It's just what crossed my mind when I first read it, and I just wanted to share that idea. But after this, up next, just mainly focusing on Jupiter's Circle, which mainly focuses on the changes that their gifts had made, either in the world or on a personal level into the people around them. But with them now having their powers and their costumes being included with the package, under Sheldon's leadership, they had then became the Union of Justice, to where they were led by Sheldon, who had just remained in the leadership role since he had started them on their journey, leading them to the island. And now that they have their powers, he had established the rules or the code of how this team would restore their country, but also not get involved with politics and only serving as public servants rather than trying to make things right with their own devices. But throughout the years for this team, problems would often arise, and they would, a lot of the time, they would stem from some kind of relationship. And one of the first examples that we'd seen from this was with Blue Bolt, who had been keeping his homosexual relationship a secret, which was then discovered by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was already spying on the team. But with discovering this, he then used it as blackmail, demanding that Blue Bolt tells him the identities of everyone in the Union of Justice. And for Blue Bolt, or Richard Conrad, this stressed him out. And he often envied how the other teammates could just live their normal lives, or at least only have to balance being a hero and having a normal life on the side. Because their leader Sheldon, he has his wife Jane in what seems to be the perfect marriage, and then you got Fitz, who's married with children, and then George, who you can either catch picking on Walter or trying to do something to impress the girls. But for Richard, he dealt with the issue of living a triple life, because not only did he just become a superhero, but he's also a neurosurgeon with a secret love interest that he believes if the world knew about, then he could lose that symbol of inspiration that a hero needs to be. And when the FBI director threatened him to give up his team's identity, it pushed him to drug abuse and attempted suicide. But fortunately, his friend and teammate Fitz, also known as the Flare, found him just in time. And the team didn't know exactly why he did this, but all they had to go off of was the note that was found next to him, which was addressed to the team that said, "I just hope you appreciate why I've done what I've done," which just bombarded his friends with confusion and grief. But also, while he was in the hospital recovering, the FBI director went to visit him, who previously had given him 12 hours to come through with the team's identities. And when he came by to strong-arm the names out of Richard, Richard refused to tell him and kicked him out immediately. But after he recovered and returned to the next team meeting, he admitted to Grace that the FBI director changed his mind and he no longer wanted to go through with his attempt at blackmail. And when Richard returned to the team, he assumed that the first thing that they wanted to do was talk to him about his situation, but Sheldon was like, nope, there's nothing to talk about. Because at this point, the team, they knew his situation, but also at this point, they kind of gave him the don't ask, don't tell option. But then right after this, we then go over to the FBI director and we find out why he didn't want to share those pictures. And it's because after Richard had been put in the hospital, the director had then got some pictures on his desk, but this time they were of himself and Federal Agent Clyde Tolson, which were taken by Skyfox to blackmail the director, and these pictures were way worse. Skyfox caught this man in the act. But then after this, we go over to the Flare's situation, because at this time, while Fitz is out in the Midwest, taking down a villain called the Puppeteer, he then saves and meets this young lady by the name of April Kelly, and when I say young, I mean 19. But then after saving her, they then have a conversation. He goes back to her place for some coffee, and they then continue this conversation to where she then tells Fitz that for a long time she's aspired to be a hero. And she doesn't have any powers, but she claims to have an intuition of sorts. So Fitz is just kind of oh yeah, that's great. Oh yeah, that's wonderful. And long story short, he stays there till 3 in the morning. But after he leaves, he goes home to his wife and he tells her about the battle with the Puppeteer, but then he claims that he was late because he had to stick around and find all the marionettes, which the Puppeteer was using, and the latter part was clearly a lie, but Fitz just made up an excuse so he could redefine the term nightcap. But soon after, the Flare, he then took April as a sidekick to where she then went under the name Miracle Girl. And when this happened, this news quickly made headlines. And when it did, Skyfox was just kind of hey bro, what you doing? But when the Flare, who was all excited about it, asked Skyfox what he thought, Skyfox just told him that he thinks a married man should be careful about who he does a team up with, to where he then called him Romeo and just took off. But even still, it's sound advice from a friend. But with Fitz continuing to see April and also partner up with her, it had then came to the point to where she had asked Fitz if he could get her on the team, and when he went to ask, they were you can't be serious, this has got to be some kind of joke. But with him arguing with the Union, he tried to throw Richie under the bus, but under Sheldon's rules, and also to protect Joyce, he's not gonna allow Fitz to have a girlfriend and a wife on the side. So Fitz, he lets April go, sends her on a bus to go on about her way, but then Fitz gets some advice from a bartender, hey, you should go after her because you may never have something like this again. And Fitz goes after April, just straight up simped for her, got her back, which then for a while put him in a bit of a fallout with the rest of the team. But not long after, when things got crazy during an invasion, which was coming from alternate versions of themselves from a parallel Earth, which is super interesting, but that part gets brushed over. But during this invasion, the team called for him back, saying that they needed the Flare, because they were crazy outnumbered and they really just needed all hands on deck. But with calling him back, he deviates from the team plan and he tries to stop one of these crashing ships by himself, and Walter tries to stop him by telling Fitz like he needs help to do this, but instead Fitz goes by himself and he tries to stop this huge ship, but it's too heavy and the ship ends up crushing him and not killing him but leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. And when he goes to the hospital, they tell him like he's gonna need someone to take care of him, and while they're there, immediately everyone looks to April, but then she's like, nope, I can't do it, I can barely take care of myself, and she tells him like, I'm only 19 years old. And with hearing this, like, Fitz knew that he had messed up with leaving everything for April, and then on top of that trying to do too much in the field, and he admits with doing everything that he was just scared of getting old, and because of his decisions he feels like he had lost everything. But Sheldon tells him like he hasn't lost everything, and when Sheldon pulls back the curtain, Fitz's wife Joyce is still there, and when he sees his family, like, he can hardly look at them. But when this happens, his wife tells him like, you are an idiot, but that doesn't mean we don't love you, and they stay with him, seeing him through to his recovery. So more or less, the moral to that story is just don't be out here simping, and it's that simple. But then after this, we then go into one of the heavy hitters as far as team drama, and it has got to be the falling out between Skyfox and Brainwave. And it's one of those things that's been a long time coming with George, aka Skyfox, who has been teasing Walter since they were kids. And like when we jump into this, you have like your first instance to where George, he just challenges Walter to fencing out of the blue, telling Walter if he loses, then he has to run through Central Park naked. And as you may have guessed, Walter lost, but George was at least a good sport and he ran with him. Okay. But this was then like an example of the norm, which then of course escalated when they got powers. But even with powers, petty things like the fencing out of the blue, like that stuff never changed. But George had then taken it to the next level at this point in the 1960s, to where he had found a couple of younger heroes who wanted to audition as a sidekick. So for their audition, he got them to remove Walter's apartment and relocate it to Africa. And when Walter found out, like, he wasn't happy about it at all. But even with Walter's powers, like, he couldn't use them on George because George had crafted some special earplugs which would keep Walter from getting in his mind. But when this happens, it's not long before George tells Walter where his penthouse is, and the back and forth kind of just fizzles out from there. But even with that situation fizzling out there, like, you can tell that Walter, he's been pushed to the point to where like he's had enough. But after this, we then go to some time later when George is about to propose to his fiance, and George is doing this by setting up explosives on the moon to say the words, "Will you marry me?" And while this is happening, like, Sheldon and his wife, they're watching from afar off, and Sheldon, the Utopian, he's using his super hearing so that he can listen in and hear the proposal and the I do. But when the words go up on the moon, and Sheldon's wife, like, she asks him like, what did she say? Is she surprised? And when this happens, like, Sheldon just has this look on his face and he doesn't respond, but he's just looking like, not exactly. But when we go over to George and Sunny, we find out that she said no, and it completely catches George off guard, and he tells her like he doesn't understand, and he asks her why. And she tells him the reason why is because she needs to marry a grown-up. But prior to this happening, we kind of saw this starting back when George had pulled the whole penthouse prank while he was teasing Walter. But it's so much more than that. We'll get to it. But then after we see Sunny walk away, we then see her with Walter. And at this point, she's unpacking all her feelings, saying how she's turning 26 next month and she wants to get married, but she doesn't want to marry someone who acts like a child. And when she goes to Walter and just telling him everything, she's like, I don't know why I came here and why I'm telling you all this. And she then kisses Walter, and now they're an item. And so now with Walter and Sunny together now, like with Walter having his telepathy, he's taking out Sunny on all kind of telepathic dates with using his psychic paintings and taking her to Paris. I'm like, oh girl, it's nothing. It's nothing. No, really, it's nothing. It's not real. But with doing this, Walter is asking Sunny, like, how do you think George is gonna take it? And Sunny's like, yeah, bad. Like, he's gonna take it real bad. And not so much because Sunny broke up with him and she's seeing someone else, but because it's another superhero. And really, like, with doing something like this, she tells him like it could get Walter kicked off of the team. But Walter's not worried about that at all. Like, he tells her the Utopian's his brother and blood's always thicker than water. And immediately George pulls up and he's ready to test that theory. And when he gets there, like, it's on site. And when George shows up, he tells Walter like, you're using your mind control on Sunny and you need to let her go. And when this happens, Blue Bolt and Liberty, they show up, and when they get there, they're just trying to calm Skyfox down because they don't know what's going on. They just see him throwing hands on Brainwave, but neither of them can stop Skyfox. Like, he just goes right through him. But then he tells Walt, like, one, that mind control is not going to work on me because he designed special earplugs to keep him out. But then when he tells Walt again to let Sonny go before he puts his head through the wall, George's fist is then caught by the Utopian, and the Utopian tells George, meet me 1 mile up immediately. And when they get up there, like, George tries to tell him, like, Sheldon, listen man, Walter's controlling Sonny's mind. He turned her against me. She's not being rational. And the Utopian is like, this is ridiculous. Like, listen to yourself. She's not being rational because she broke up with you. And when he tells George, like, she's met someone else, like, you need to accept it. And when George hears that, he cusses Sheldon out and he just quits the team. But with George leaving, like, he completely disappeared. No one in the Union could tag a location on him, but with leaving, he transferred his whole estate over to Sheldon, with the exception of a large portion of funds, which he had his lawyer just put away. But after this, we then jump forward and Walter ends up marrying Sonny, which then strikes a bit of suspicion with Sheldon, with him later finding out how much Sonny had meant to George. And so at this point, like 15 weeks out from George leaving the Union, Walter completes George's project of building Supermax, which was the prison designed to hold thousands of supervillains. And at this time when the prison was complete and Sheldon and Walter were just kind of having candid conversation, Sheldon asked his brother Walter, like, was it true that he used his powers to break up George and Sonny? And you can tell, like, with doing this, that Sheldon was trying to ease the question in, like, as gently as possible. But with Sheldon even asking this, Walter immediately took offense, and he tells Sheldon, like, this is why we're not close, and he just walks off without confirming or denying the allegation. And when Walter leaves, Grace Sampson, or Lady Liberty, she steps in, asking Sheldon if he's heard anything from George, and when he says no, she comforts him and tries to cheer him up a bit by telling Sheldon that George will be back. But in the case of George, like, I thought he was gonna be on a 12-hour flight with all his feelings, cause, you know, when it gets like this, you need distance. And I don't know who's gonna catch that reference. But when we find George, we then go over to Kentucky, where cop cars are racing around this diner. And when I first seen this, all I could think of was Bobby V and Lil Wayne. But when we go here and see the waitresses asking, like, what's going on, we see George in the diner where he responds probably armed robbery, and he says it very calmly because he has no plans on going out there and trying to stop it. But instead, when he's done, he just gets up, goes out, and goes on about his way. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.